Hey For the Wild community, Ziana here, speaking to you from the Allied Media Conference in Detroit, Michigan. I'll be hosting a panel Saturday on objectivity, intimacy, and integrity in journalism and storytelling. So if you're here, I would love to connect and say hello. In other news, we are on the lookout for land partners for the 1 Million Redwoods Project. So if you're a land steward and are interested in partnering on our biodiversity enhancement test plots and tree plantings, email us at engage@forthewild.world. We're also looking for some help at Cougar Mountain. So if you have any carpentry or building experience for our seed and fungal library, email forthewildworld@gmail.com. And lastly, we are open to sponsorships. So if you're interested in sponsoring this podcast so that we can keep going week in, week out, email us at engage@forthewild.world. All right, now on to our conversation with JACINDA MACK.
People need to become activated, and the apathy is what's going to kill us. The giving up, saying it's too big, it's going to happen anyway, that's what's going to kill us.
The silence is broken by somebody crying, trying to be heard, never a word. Always the attitude, sort out your own, always alone, wishing for something the world is denying. Out in the wilderness somebody's crying. Somebody wishing for something to happen, wishing to tell, wishing to help. Someone was listening, someone who cared, never despaired. Someone to lean on and someone to trust, who needs your assistance and finds your disgust.
Hello and welcome to For the Wild podcast. I'm Ayana Young. From the Arctic to the Gulf Coast, the tar sands to the Balkan oil fields, we've learned about the impacts of oil extraction often on this show. But today we'll be delving into another arm of the same beast, mining. The devastations wrought by mining seem to garner much less visibility than oil development. Yet British Columbia is effectively experiencing a second gold rush, as environmental deregulation has paved the way for the mining industry to operate without any obligation to the people, lands, or waters they are irreparably poisoning. As many as 10 large-scale mines are in development across the BC-Alaska transboundary region, including the largest open-pit copper and gold mine on Turtle Island, the KSM mine, just across the border from Ketchikan, Alaska, in the heart of wild salmon country. To join us in this conversation, we are honored to welcome JACINDA MACK. JACINDA MACK knows better than most how devastating mining disasters can be. Her indigenous community of Xat'sull, located in Williams Lake, British Columbia, was severely impacted by Imperial Metal's Mount Polley Mine tailings dam disaster in 2014. Salmon and clean water on which communities throughout the region depend were severely impacted. As mother, water protector, and indigenous woman, Mount Polley was by no means the beginning of JACINDA's concerns. For years, she has spoken out about threats posed by badly regulated mining activity in BC through organizations like First Nations Women Advocating Responsible Mining. JACINDA has become a thought leader on water protection and mining reform throughout the province and beyond. JACINDA is from the Secwepemc and Newhook indigenous nations. Raised on the land and in her indigenous communities, she has worked with First Nations communities on the central and northwest coast of BC as a community organizer, researcher, natural resource manager, and self-government coordinator on First Nations territory-related issues. JACINDA's advocacy and storytelling is featured in 2 recent award-winning documentaries, X-Boundary and Uprivers. She is an artist, songwriter, costume maker, and contributes to several publications, including the Huffington Post and Canadian Geographic Atlas Indigenous Canada editions. JACINDA is the BC Advisor of Indigenous Leadership Initiative. She holds a Master's of Arts degree from York University's Communication and Culture program and a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Victoria. Thank you so much for joining us, JACINDA.
Thank you for having me on your show.
So to start us off with a sense of place, would you mind telling us about the lands and waters that raised you, and how the presence of the mining industry and the Mount Polley tailings dam disaster has impacted the way your community is able to make relationship with your more than human relatives?
Absolutely. I would love to talk about the beautiful land I was raised on. As we all know, the land that, we grow up in as Indigenous people, this is where we get our identity, where our identities are formed. I was raised in my mother's territory of the Secwepemc people, and in this area, it's pine forests. The Fraser River runs through the canyon, which starts in our community. I grew up fishing at night in the summertime on the river for sockeye salmon. We would have sockeye eggs in the morning for breakfast. And that was just part of our way of life. And we would move through the seasons doing different harvesting activities, whether we were working in our big garden or maybe it was fall time and it was hunting season and it was time to hunt for deer and moose. This is how we grew up. And I'm also from the coastal nation of the Nuklalk people. And here we have giant snow-capped mountains and dense rainforest. It's part of what is now known as the Great Bear Rainforest. We were just out harvesting in springtime here in the Nuklalk territory, getting medicines and preparing for all of the different activities for winter, such as harvesting cedar for weaving and ceremonial purposes. So it is really still a very big part of my life. And the older I get, the more I realize those connections are really critical to maintaining my sense of who I am and place, and to make sure that I maintain that for myself so that I can pass it on to my children, my nieces and nephews. And, when the Mount Polley Mine Disaster happened, it was a collective response from everybody. It was like a death that happened, and it rippled not only throughout our territory, but into neighboring territories who are also on the Fraser River. And beyond that, because there's so many mines that are spread out throughout British Columbia, throughout Canada, and around the world. People from Brazil were reaching out to us because they have huge mines and dams in their territory as well. And so through this disaster, I have learned so much, and it's actually such an awakening for so many people to understand what the realities of mining are. And it's like this sleeping giant that people are only becoming aware of with this disaster.
To think that the mining industry took Mount Polley not as a wake-up call, but as a green light to continue and expand business as usual is sickening, and especially when experts warn that BC can expect 2 such ruptures per decade, on top of the fact that there are already 2,000 abandoned mines in BC, 2/3 of which are spewing pollutants. So with that in mind, could you expand upon how Imperial Metals has gotten away with resuming full operations and the dumping of wastewater into Quesnel Lake without any compensation to the local Indigenous peoples?
The laws in British Columbia around mining are basically from the 1850s and 1860s, really when the first gold rushes were happening and getting bigger. And really we've been dealing with mining and this gold rush and gold fever since that time. A lot of the mining laws are the basis for the actual colonization of the province of British Columbia. And so they are held as basically as the central laws around which other laws have been built. So they have the highest value. Mining is considered in British Columbia as the highest use of the land. And so this runs, of course, very contrary to our Indigenous beliefs, really across all nations around values for protecting clean water, for having a clean environment, and also being an integral piece of a balanced environment. And so when the disaster happened, we met with the mine and we asked them, what is your disaster response plan? What is your plan? We haven't seen that. What is it that you're going to do? And they responded that they didn't have a disaster response plan because it wasn't required by the province of British Columbia. It wasn't part of their permit, therefore they didn't have anything. And so we were shocked that this was another piece of mining law that was missing, and that mining they say is in, the interest of all of the province or in the national interest, but really it's for the benefit of the mining companies and the governments that receive the taxes from it, the royalties from mining. And so the mine really is only going to ever do what is in their permit. And each mining permit is unique to that mine. So there will be, you have your standard mining regulations that are supposed to be followed, but there are different acts that come into play also. So you have the Mines Act, you have the Environment Act, and in some cases you'll have other acts coming into place like Forest Lands Natural Resources, where it's dealing more with the forestry aspect when you're dealing with road building. But even then, if you have a mine road that doesn't meet the forestry requirements, you can say, well, it's actually under our mining lease, so it doesn't apply to us. So there's all of these off-ramps for mining to get these kind of free rides all over the place. And after the disaster happened, we really found out how little the government is willing to do to keep these mines in check. Because, obviously, with that amount, you had, I think it was compared to 10,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools of mine waste that had been released into the environment. And the company response was to basically re-engineer the creek that it went down to go back into operation, stitch up its tailing storage facility that broke, and then just continue to operate. And that's what happened. And so you have these laws that are favoring mining at every different angle, at the expense of the environment, at the expense of the communities that depend on that clean water, that depend on that immediate area for food and sustenance. You have these really rural communities that are surrounding these mines, and they choose to live there because they love that way of life. You have indigenous people who use that land that's part of our very DNA, for over 10,000 years. And when we would go to these community meetings, it would be meeting after meeting after meeting of the mine basically dictating the conversation, and the government and the communities would respond. And so this has been the way of mining since it was started in British Columbia. And this is what we're trying to address, to say, actually, no, we need to be directing this conversation. We need to be saying what is safe for our communities, and we need to take that level of interpretation by the mine out of the equation, and we need to take that back. Because Mount Polley, this disaster, we need to use it as an opportunity to change these laws. Otherwise, as their own experts have said, 2 every decade. And there was another disaster recently in Australia. And I think what a lot of people don't understand is that this Canadian model is being exported around the world. Canada is the center point. It's the eye of the storm for mining in the world. Most mining companies in the world are registered in Canada because the laws are so privileged towards mining that it makes sense for them to make the most money by setting up their companies here. So what we do with Mount Polley is really important, not only in our community and in our watershed, but around the world, because people are watching.
What do you think proper reparations would look like when it's so difficult to even begin to quantify the cultural and psychological dimensions of environmental harm? And what actions do you see as absolutely vital in going forward?
I think that British Columbia really needs to step up to the plate and honor its own laws and to enforce its own laws. There was a private prosecution that was brought forward, not by the provincial government, but actually by my mother, Bev Sellers, who stepped in on the last day of the statute of limitations, which was last year, August 4th, 2017, which would be 3 years after the disaster, to step in to press criminal charges against the company for breaching, I think, 15 counts that they had brought up under the Environment Act and the Mines Act. And the province took those charges over and dismissed them, stating that there wasn't enough evidence. And I think that goes to show how inadequate the system is, and in a lot of ways how corrupt the system is. These companies donate a lot of money to different political parties, and they have a lot of lobbying power. And it's just, they need to live up to their laws. They need to be enforced. They need to have proper monitoring and compliance, because in the Auditor General Carol Bellringer's report, she had said that, you can't have one ministry, the Ministry of Energy and Mines, who's supposed to be permitting and monitoring and keeping these mines in check, but they're the same ministry that's also promoting mining in British Columbia. So you have an extreme conflict of interest. And you have also the mines who are basically self-monitoring and doing all of the work that the government should be doing to be keeping them in check. And so, that's a real problem. The other thing that needs to happen immediately is for the government to uphold its obligations to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And both British Columbia and Canada have stated that they support that and that they are going to be working with that as the new model of how to deal with projects and how to deal with Indigenous people as government-to-government relationships. And we really haven't been seeing this. Right now, the same governments that promised that have done nothing about Mount Polley. They've actually taken over charges at the federal and provincial level and dismissed them. Right now in British Columbia, Premier John Horgan is saying that he's upholding no Kinder Morgan pipeline coming in to protect water and the people, yet he completely ignores the Site C dam up in the Treaty 8 Polley Lake area and completely ignoring things around Mount Polley. So the government can't be cherry picking when they choose to uphold these rights. It's across the board. And so we've been working with folks up in Alaska and expanding our network to other areas in Montana, Washington State, working with different Indigenous people to say, okay, we need to define what upholding the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People looks like for us. And we need to get in front of any type of government interpretation which we fear will simply water down the spirit and the intent and the value of what that declaration brings to us. And with British Columbia upholding its own laws and Canada upholding its own laws and enforcing them and the application of the declaration, I think that's a really good place to start. And we're also looking at other options around, what is the professional community doing about this as well. One of the initiatives that we're really looking at as a tool to get mining companies on board is the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, or IRMA for short. And so we're looking at all of these better standards to clean up this industry, because the reality is that we have so many mines that are already in operation or have been in operation for a very long time. And these have all been built without any kind of consent from Indigenous people. And that process just wasn't implemented. So we're trying to catch up with what exactly is best technology, what exactly are the best practices, because the companies will state that they're using those when in reality they're paying for the cheapest way forward, which is the experience that we've had with the Mount Polley mine. So there's a lot of work to be done, for sure.
I hear that. I've also heard you describe mining as a waste storage industry, speaking to the fact that over 90% of what comes out of a mine is waste. So I'd like to hear more specifically about the tailing ponds, which are essentially supposed to store waste forever, as their toxicity never fades or disappears. So what exactly do these tailing ponds contain, and how are they regulated and maintained?
Yeah, so on mining sites, most of what comes out of a mine, or most of what is produced in a mine, is waste, especially when you're looking at really low-grade mines that don't have a lot of heavy concentrations of whatever it is that you're after. In our territory, a lot of it is gold and copper. And the whole process, by law, they have to keep the waste stored separately. And what they've processed to extract the gold or the silver or the copper or the molybdenum or whatever they're after is mixed in a process when they bring the higher concentrate rock into the mill. They'll crush it up into a very fine kind of rock flour, they call it, and they'll mix it with water and mix it with chemicals and do this flotation system. These are the ones that I've seen. And they'll float whatever they're after to the top, skim it off, and continue processing it that way. But once they've extracted whatever it is that they want, then they have to do something with all of the waste. And so this is where it gets basically piped out to the tailings storage facility. And by law, it has to be contained. And so it has to be contained so that it's not entering into the environment and just mixing in, because you have high concentrations of like heavy metals. You have things like mercury and selenium. You've got like your different like flotation chemicals that are mixed in with that. And not only that, but in tailings facilities, you will also have, sometimes you'll have outside materials that aren't even related to mining. Like at the Mount Polley site, one of the things that they have is treated sewage that's being trucked in from the greater Vancouver area, so these large urban centers. And so they'll heat treat the sewage and drop out the moisture out of the sewage, and then they'll use it on mine sites in their what they call reclamation. So they'll cover these big rock dumps, so the stuff that doesn't make it into the mill that's been blasted, and they'll have these big rock dumps, and you've probably seen it before and just didn't know what it was, and it'll be this kind of perfectly sloped hillside, and they'll cover it with some of the dirt and leftover trees to, try to slow down erosion. And then they'll mix in all of this treated sewage on this hillside, and then they'll plant grass on it to help stabilize the soils from blowing away or, runoff. And so you have this kind of weird looking hillside of grass on these perfectly sloped areas around mine sites. And that's what they call reclamation, returning the site back to nature. And, when you look at the area around a mine site, often it does not look like that at all. In the case of Mount Polley, it's thick interior rainforest. And so when you think of this weird landscape filled with sewage and grass and waste rock, that's absolutely nothing of what the natural landscape looks like. And so you have these tailings facilities that are containing this waste. You have these rock dumps that are filled with all of this waste. And when that disaster happened, when that dam broke and released all of that into the environment, it took that static facility and it's loose in the world now. So it's loose in the entire watershed. And when that happened, it was right, during fishing season in the summertime, and the entire Fraser River, there are First Nations all along the river, right from the different headwaters all the way to the mouth in Vancouver, and nobody fished. We didn't know what to expect. We didn't know how that was going to impact the salmon, how, all of that wastewater was going to be impacted. So there were huge immediate consequences around this tailings facility. And all of these things that are released from the facility are in the lake. They're along the creek beds. They've been released into the Fraser system. The Quesnel Lake is a great big major salmon nursery for all species of salmon in British Columbia. And there's just so many unknowns. And, it was something that our people grieved for. We know that you can't have that amount of pollution released into the environment, into the birthing waters of the salmon, and have no impact. And so this year and next year will be, and probably more next year, will be the really big indicator of what some of those impacts are starting to look like, because the salmon, are on a 4 and 5 year cycles. So next year will be the first year that the salmon who had to nest in the pollution in that nursery will have to come back. It's a lot of unknowns, and what we're being told by the government, what we're being told by the company is that basically there's been no impact, that there's nothing to worry about, there's been no sign of any kind of changes, and it's just too fantastic of a claim to make. I think it's irresponsible, and it's dangerous also, because these harms are going to be over time. They're going to be over generations, and the company's solution is to do nothing other than what they need to get back into operations. So that's a real danger too. That's a real dangerous precedent that other mines are definitely watching to say, oh, you can have the biggest environmental disaster in this country's history, and you're not even going to get a $20 fine. Nothing has been fined. No charges have been laid. And the company is saying, oh, well, we have an ongoing investigation, which is true. There's one more investigation that's still going. But given that Canada has done nothing, British Columbia has done nothing to date, it's really difficult to have faith in a system that is regarding mining as the highest use of the land, and that the response that we've received in the communities has been extremely disappointing.
I think about how Canada has more mine tailing spills than any country in the world aside from China. And hearing about this toxic legacy that the mining industry is leaving as an inheritance for future generations. What happens when the selenium and copper and the arsenic become bioavailable to the Saskatoon berries and huckleberries, and with the heavy metal accumulated in the bodies of the bears and the salmon, like you'd been talking about these salmon that have been nesting in these places. It's just so heavy and horrible. And I remember actually talking to Faith Jamil from the Arctic and Sherry Foytland from the Gulf Coast about how their regions are considered energy sacrifice zones. And similarly, areas with industrial mining could be considered luxury sacrifice zones, because this is what is primarily coming out of these mines is luxury items. Sacred mountains demolished and headwaters poisoned for gold rings and copper wires.
Absolutely. There's enough gold that's already been mined on Earth that no more gold needs to be mined. And it's a luxury item. I think the figure that I've seen repeatedly is about 80% of all gold mined goes towards jewelry. And, we really need to also check our language around gold as being this ultimate luxury or ultimate standard, like, the gold standard to be treated like gold. I was asked once what I think of when I hear the word gold. I said, I think of pollution. I think of people being murdered in Central and South America. I think of these luxury items that people don't need, but they just want. I think of greed. And that has been the experience of our people. When the BC Caribou Gold Rush happened in the 1860s, smallpox was deliberately introduced. And this has been proven repeatedly and through the journals of government officials and different people who've been involved. And these stories are finally surfacing. Our people knew that from the start. And we were ridiculed for saying that. It's finally coming to light by very meticulously documented academic writing. Yes, it's true. And here's the proof. Smallpox was introduced to eliminate these very sophisticated trade networks that existed here in what is now known as British Columbia throughout different indigenous territories. And so this devastation was to remove us from the land. And, these diseases, this is what happened across, North America, South America for gold. And gold is really, and this gold fever, this crazy mind is what is driving the human rights violations, the murders, the deaths. Murdered and missing Indigenous women, these big man camps that are associated with these big construction projects, industrial projects, pollution of water, pollution of the land. And what we're asking for, what we're trying to maintain and protect is simply our way of life and a clean environment. And we are part of this land, and we have deep, deep knowledge and deep experience and connection and spiritual connection to the lands that we're from. And it's really difficult to explain that to somebody, especially like an executive or a politician whose values and point of reference and sense of identity comes from a very different place. And so this is this kind of these worldview differences that we're trying to navigate. So we learn how to use different tools to try to protect what we are most closely tied to with the land. All of the work that we're doing is about protecting things for 7 generations ahead. And a lot of our knowledge is, it really bothers me when I see a company, like a mining company, take on an Indigenous name and name their company that name. An example is Xat'sull Mines, which comes from Dazico, which is from the Xat'sull, from the territory it's in. So it implies consent. And another thing the companies do is that they will have agreements with communities, but they're not consent agreements. Xat'sull First Nation, where I grew up, has an agreement with Mount Polley Mine. And the agreement is to share information ahead of time so that we know what they're planning, so we know what permits that they're applying for, that we have a heads up on what's going on. And the idea is that there's no surprises. It's not a consent agreement. And within the agreement, it states that it's not a consent agreement and that consent is something that has to be worked towards. These are just kind of operational agreements of how to communicate with each other. But the companies will take these agreements and say they're consent. And I heard recently a very high-ranking government official in BC was saying, Well, if there's an agreement, that means there's consent, and it's a one-time consent, and you get it once, and then that's it. And I think anybody who's ever been in a relationship knows that there's no such thing as a one-time consent. It's ongoing. And these agreements aren't consent agreements, and the consent has to come from the community or the nation at large. And so there's a lot of posturing and positioning and twisting of what's happening on the ground, and people are often misinformed. And, when it's coming from the indigenous people, what we're saying is often not valued as highly as what's coming from government or the industry, who have much bigger voices and a lot more money to put what they're saying out there. So there's a very unbalanced power dynamic that's going on. But I'm hopeful that, there are a lot more people who are becoming aware of what's going on and are outraged at the way that communities are being treated, the way that indigenous people are being treated, and that people are starting to take action and starting to get educated about these issues. I think with the Mount Polley Mine Disaster, a lot of people became really educated about mining that knew nothing about mining before. And from what I was seeing on social media and the emails that I was receiving, people were asking very informed questions and reading these huge government documents and reading the permits and, really getting engaged. So I think that there are a lot of people, especially in British Columbia, who are outraged that nothing has been done about Mount Polley and who want a better future, who want a cleaner future. And they're seeing right now with the Kinder Morgan protests that having that support from the BC government to protect water, it's like, okay, that's great. We do need to do that. And I totally support that. And we also need to address mining, and we need to address indigenous rights, and that it's not just pick one here and pick one there. It has to be across the board. So these are all of the issues that I feel are starting to come together. And I would really love to see all of these different kind of silos of your people who are working on pipelines and people who are working on fish farms and big hydroelectric dams and mining. We all need to be talking and working together because it's all for the same thing. It's all for protecting our communities. It's for protecting long-term sustainability. It's for protecting the water. And if we can protect the water, if we can stand for water as the most basic life-sustaining thing, then we can also get the bigger picture and work together across these different campaigns.
Yeah, I want to speak more about working together across campaigns. And I recently was speaking with Dune Langcard, who's the co-founder of Red Oil and the Native Conservancy Land Trust and the EAC Preservation Council from Cordova, Alaska. And Dune has been really pivotal in the protection of thousands of acres of indigenous land. And from his experience, he urges that creativity is mandatory in how we go about preserving land and lifeways in these really tumultuous times. And these coalitions forming in response to transboundary mining impacts along the BC-Alaska border are exemplary of the collaborative thrust that we need for our initiatives to be loud and successful. So I'd love to hear about the collaborations your organization, First Nations Women Advocating Responsible Mining, is growing, and how important you see authentic relationship building being right now.
Oh, absolutely. I think that is really key. First Nations Women Advocating Responsible Mining is really about advocating a responsible way to engage with communities, a responsible way to engage with the land. And, sometimes the responsible thing is to not have a mine in a specific area, especially at salmon headwaters. This is something that we've been really working with a lot of communities on, is trying to amplify those indigenous voices around what the values are and what the solutions are. Because it's not just enough to say we disagree with this. It's really important to come to the table with a solution. And communities have solutions. A lot of the work that we're doing is trying to connect different people together and to really do whatever we can to foster those conversations to happen with or without us at FN Warm, and to connect different communities who are going through similar things or who are opposite ends of the spectrum. For example, in the kind of the Northwest British Columbia, Southeast Alaska transboundary area, they're connected by some major rivers up there. And so you have, for example, at the headwaters of the Stikine, you have the Tahltan people who have been doing a lot of work around protecting their headwaters and their salmon. The Stikine River goes down and empties into Southeast Alaska in the community of Wrangell, which is Tlingit territory. And so there have been these meetings and wanting to have gatherings of bringing the people together and sharing their knowledge and sharing strategic actions that they can take together as united across this river and their history and their language. And it's been really incredible to see a lot of these connections come together. Recently, I was at a gathering in Polley Lake, Washington, and this was organized by tribes in Southeast Alaska, and they invited a lot of different people to this gathering. There were people there from across British Columbia, Alaska, the Yukon. There was a delegate from Idaho, Washington State, Montana, and basically anywhere, any like state or province that borders with British Columbia has a problem with British Columbia, which says a lot about how resources are being managed in BC. And so a lot of the work that we're doing right now is gathering people together who have common issues and solutions around mining and how mining is being dealt with in BC. That the idea is to also reach out farther to talking with folks around the pipelines and the dams and the fish farming, and to have a common voice and to be really pushing the government to say, like, we are organizing according to our bloodlines, not borders. We are organizing according to family relationships, according to traditional trade networks, according to our values of the land and our values for our way of life, and for water and for salmon and for all of these shared resources and shared things that we still depend on as Indigenous people for our way of life. There's another gathering that I have just recently heard of that will be in the Xat'sull Nation along the Fraser River that is pulling together interior Indigenous peoples and coastal Indigenous peoples around salmon. And salmon is a really important piece of all of this because the salmon represents so much. It's not only keystone for our culture, for our food, for trade, all of these things, not only for human beings, but for all different kinds of animals, for the forest. The forest needs the salmon to grow, to have these big trees. So we're trying to pull together people from all over to say, come, let's all gather together and work this out and figure out where the commonalities lie, where our strengths lie. How can we strategically approach this? Who's going to be doing what? A lot of the work that we do at FNWARM, we also work with outside of the Indigenous community. We work with Amnesty International, Mining Watch Canada, the Fair Mining Collaborative, which is based here in British Columbia, UVic Environmental Law Center, Concerned Citizens of Quesnel Lake. We're reaching out with this Stand for Water tour to go into communities to connect with more people and to basically say that, you know, we share these common values and we share these concerns. So let's pull them all together and have one collective voice and really have a lot of pressure and comments and solutions coming from the ground to government because they obviously need our help. They obviously need our help. If they're not doing what is right for the people, then we need to take that power back and we need to say, okay, this is what you need to do. This is what we need to be done to have these solutions coming up. So it's really a grassroots movement around providing these solutions and stepping in and intervening with elected leadership to say, this needs to be corrected. And these laws around mining need to be corrected and they need to be updated. They're so out of date. You can imagine mining in the 1850s and 1860s with, you know, pickaxes and shovels and homemade sluice boxes compared to these dams now that are happening like at Red Chris Mine or the one proposed at the KSM mine that are over 20 stories tall and who have these giant hydroelectric shovels and big haul trucks that are, you know, 200 tons that haul 200 tons at a time. These are mega scale projects and you have this outdated legislation dealing with pickaxes and shovels. So it's kind of ridiculous actually.
I was just thinking about the word ridiculous when you were explaining all this. And I was literally thinking to myself, this is ridiculous. And absolutely, gosh, the legislation and the regulations, at minimum, those need to be shifted. And gosh, when you were talking about some of these solutions, I thought, where does the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples fit into all of this? And I was also wondering about the IJC, the International Joint Commission, and what role that could have in halting the development of projects like the KSM mine, whose impacts don't know political borders at all.
right? You've got these international tools that we need to be looking at. And, it's really important for people to understand that these international tools are put there to have a bigger picture, a bigger scope and scale of things, to know that what we do locally, you might have your idea, well, it's in likely BC. Oh, well, actually that extends to the Caribou. No, that extends to the Fraser watershed. No, actually that extends out to the entire Pacific region, right? And beyond, because we're all connected by water. And this International Joint Commission with the Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909 was created specifically to address when there's pollution coming across the border, how to deal with it collectively and to make sure that it's being addressed so that you're not polluting your neighbor, basically. I feel like we need that in British Columbia within the different jurisdictions. You have all of these different ministries that don't talk to each other. And I've been to different tables where it feels like you're like at an international summit because, the Ministry of Energy and Mines, the Ministry of Environment, FLNRO, you've got all of these different ministries sitting at the table and they're trying to come up with a solution. But really, all of the laws should be complementary and they should be cumulative to deal with these things. And so when you have these actual international instruments like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People or the International Joint Commission to Address Pollution, they have so much value and they have so many solutions built within them that internally within British Columbia, these systems aren't working, obviously, because you have a disaster like Mount Polley, which is a failure both at the mine site, their oversight of their operations, and it's a failure of the province of British Columbia and their laws for not being monitored and, being out of compliance and having no penalties. So there's really no incentive for them to follow these rules. So now that we move into this international arena, we're feeling like we have to go outside of Canada because what's working inside of Canada, it's not working. It's favoring these companies and it's not protecting the people that these laws are supposed to protect and to protect the land and this integrated system of the whole ecosystem. So with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, there are so many solutions within there that get to protecting way of life, protecting values on the land, protecting clean environment, all of these things. And these have been worked on by Indigenous people from around the world. And so this is a global instrument to address these harms that are happening to Indigenous people. And the work that Indigenous people do to protect their way of life, wherever they happen to be, or myself included, this is going to protect everybody. It's not going to protect just Indigenous people because it's going to be protecting clean water. It's going to be protecting clean air, clean soil. Every single thing that we need as human beings comes from the earth. And I think that people forget that super basic reality. Every single thing that we need comes from the earth. And people are so disconnected, I feel, in a lot of ways that they forget that. And they're not out there, growing their own food, or they're not seeing what's happening on the river every day because they're so removed from it. So people tend to live in this virtual reality world where it's all about consumerism and the latest technology and what's going on Facebook. And you have all of these alternate universes that are actually not even connected to where we get our food or where we draw our water. And the International Joint Commission is something that we're trying to get the attention of the federal governments to say, there's a problem here and you need to be aware of it. And a lot of the movement that we've received from British Columbia has been in direct response to Alaska ringing the bell, saying, there is a major problem happening in British Columbia. Alaskans need to know about this. Americans need to know about this. British Columbia is potentially setting us up for a major disaster in our waters. And so, using these international instruments is a really good way of waking up the British Columbia government to saying, okay, you have higher obligations here. And the thing is that British Columbia has said, we agree to uphold this declaration protecting Indigenous people. And that doesn't just apply to Indigenous people in British Columbia. That's all Indigenous people. So all these different borders surrounding British Columbia, there's Indigenous people in every single area because we're still here and we're still in our home territories. So I don't know that British Columbia fully realizes the obligation that it has agreed to uphold, but we're having to use outside larger international instruments because we need to use every tool that we have. So working internally within the environmental assessment reform talks that are happening now, working with our local grassroots communities, but also working with Amnesty International, working with using the declaration as a tool for people to understand, having these conversations in our community, upping the education level on this critical, we're at this tipping point right now. And, you see that with demonstrations around the world. We're at a tipping point where this capitalistic system based on luxury and consumerism is killing us. It's killing the planet. And we're seeing around the world also, if you follow the conversations around what's happening with water, is that fresh water sources, drinking water sources are starting to disappear around the world and are predicted to disappear in major cities, especially really hot regions like in South Africa, certain places in like New Mexico and Arizona. In California, you look at the wildfires that are happening, wildfires that are changing entire weather systems. We experienced this in Secwepemc country last summer when we were evacuated. So the earth is changing very quickly, and we need to have a major shift in how we operate and what we consume and what we value for our very survival. And that's as basic as you can get, is we have to change things quickly or things are going to change catastrophically for us. So we need to do that work right away.
I couldn't agree more. I feel the urgency that you're describing, and I think we all need to actually commit tangibly to this earth right now if we haven't already, and join forces. And I've been so interested hearing about the different strategies, these international tools that you've been using, community organizing, and I also am thinking about tools of creativity and how we really need to also be extremely creative in how we make these assaults on land and people visible to more people. And I'm curious, as a songwriter and an artist, what do you think the role of writers, filmmakers, photographers an artist is in documenting the effects of mining?
I think that the creativity is key. And I think that is the key to really changing the system. We have to imagine something beyond the status quo. We have to imagine something outside of the norm, because the norm is really screwed up. The norm is killing us, right? This Western capitalistic system, we need songwriters out there. And it's really actually a really exciting time to follow different Indigenous artists who are extremely intelligent and clever and creative and in the work that they're doing. There's an exhibit happening right now down in, I think it's in New Mexico, from an artist named Nick Golanin, who's a Tlingit artist from Alaska, who speaks directly to a lot of different issues about colonization. And he's also a musician. He's also carving a totem pole right now up in Juneau. So big props to him. I just met him recently on a work-related trip to Alaska to talk about mining. And people are starting to connect. People who are of like minds are coming together. And there are other artists here in British Columbia who, one of my favorite music artists is a band, Indigenous duo called Mob Bounce, and they have very politically inspired lyrics, and they're reaching out and doing a lot of work with the youth in Indigenous communities, which is also really important to really empower the youth coming up. You've got people who are doing these really amazing paintings that are that are these kind of fusions of their traditional culture and kind of mashing it up with a reimagined future. And I think that's what we need to do, is we need to get away from all of these apocalyptic storylines that you see in movies. Like, it's always, when you go to the theater, the public imagination or whoever's creating these big mainstream films, it's always apocalyptic. And it's always about death and power and greed and what that brings to it, and I think we need to reimagine what we can do and what we should be doing together. I think we need to really focus our energy on how we can do it better, what we can do as individuals, what we can do in our communities. And sometimes it really feels like you don't know, you can't see the work that you're doing, how it's impacting others or how it's going to be picked up in the future. It's really difficult to know that. So you just have to have faith that what you're doing is with the right intent, and it's part of your love story for the land. I talk about love stories for the land, and really coming from this place of love to put that into your work of why we do this work. I'm a mother, and I imagine a future for my children, for my bloodline coming after me. I imagine a future for them that they are living back on the territory, that they're off of these Indian reserves, that they're out of this colonial stranglehold. Colonization has put such a huge traumatizing impact on our communities, and not only for Indigenous people, for settler Canadians as well, because we've been led down this path to believe that things are a certain way, which it really isn't. It's really our choice. And so I think that creativity part, through music, through film, through photography, through painting, through dance, these are all opportunities to really express those relationships and the beauty of the land, the beauty of our cultures, and that really deep connectedness that we have with who we are as Indigenous people. And it's going to be different across every different territory, every different First Nation, every different tribe. It's going to be different because we have a very unique relationship with the land in that area, and that's really beautiful. And to see the language revitalization that's coming back, everything that's in the language comes from the land. So the more that you can understand your language, the more you understand how beautiful that land is and how beautiful your connection is. So I think that being really creative around this, and for people to go where people are gathered, to say, wow, I see an opportunity here to create a song or to create a piece that will speak to that, because you can do things in art and say things in art that reach people in a way that simply speaking to them won't. You can really reach them at their heart. You can really reach them in their imagination and inspire them in a way through art that is just so incredibly powerful. So I really encourage people to really use that creative inspiration and channel that hurt or that anger or that love or whatever it is that you're feeling into shifting this consciousness. I think it's super important.
I've lost friends to overdoses, suicide and blues. I'm not asking for understanding, I just want to tell my tale. I'm not asking for understanding, I just want to tell my tale. I'm not asking for understanding, I just want to tell my tale. I'm not asking for understanding, I just want to tell my tale.
Being able to use creativity and open up this radical imagination like you were talking about, being able to imagine a different future, we have to start there. We have to really be able to see what we can work towards and how we can move out of this extremely colonized, traumatized place. And I just think about how much power these transnational corporations have and how they've continued this legacy of colonization, and they're strategic in how they work to defeat and divide people. And I'm reminded of a dear co-conspirator, Candy Mossett from North Dakota, who shared with us last year how deeply it wrenched her when her tribal council took money from the oil companies, extracting from her territory, and how the council's response was along the lines of, if you can't beat them, join them, because the company planned on going along with the projects at all cost anyways. Similarly, I've been reading about the mutual benefit agreements that First Nations have been signing with Kinder Morgan over the Trans Mountain Pipeline, agreements that typically include payment in exchange for not opposing a project. So, what do you know about these mutual benefit agreements? And what would you say in response to the idea that fighting is futile?
I would say that the whole messaging around fighting is futile is a lot of effort and a lot of money put out by the companies who need your consent to convince you that you're powerless. And these companies put out a lot of money and effort into their public relations campaigns, into pressuring tactics to get First Nations to sign on to different agreements. And I would say that there are a lot of people who want to do the right thing, and they need other people to speak up and stand up with them. And sometimes you might be the first one in your community to do that, or maybe the only one at first, but it doesn't mean that people don't support what you're doing. They just might be afraid. And people have been conditioned their entire lives to be afraid of the government, to be afraid of the police, to be afraid of the system, right? Indigenous people have been oppressed for many, many generations, over 500 years since this relationship. But I also believe that we have really strong, smart, motivated people out there who are going to continue working at this and trying to reach out one person at a time to create this shift. And I feel like there is a shift that's happening. People are becoming more aware. And I think that it's just continuing with that, continuing, even though maybe you can't see where the ripples are. I remember listening to that interview with Candy, and it was super inspiring and motivating to me. You just never know where your reach is going to go. And you just never know how you're going to impact somebody. And these mutual benefit agreements, my understanding around the Kinder Morgan projects is that basically for some of the First Nations that they say, if things go forward, if you receive consent from the First Nations who are directly along the path, then we agree to be part of this project, and that includes a benefit agreement that we receive some compensation out of this. I don't know the details around every agreement, of course. I don't have that inside track on what those agreements are, but I think that the company is also using these agreements to divide and conquer First Nations and to create animosity, bad feelings between communities, which works in their favor. So I think it's really important for all of these different communities to be speaking with each other and not including the company in those conversations, not including the government in those conversations, and to be saying, okay, what exactly is it that you're agreeing to, or what exactly is it that you are not agreeing to? Are you standing with us for consent? Are you, as a First Nation community, going to be upholding free, prior, informed consent? Those conversations need to happen, and often they're very difficult, but they are so critical. Sharing information and being very clear around what it is that they're agreeing to, because I think that those agreements can be used by companies against the very people that they're signing them with, and to divide communities, which is a pretty standard tactic dealing with corporations.
Absolutely, yeah. Using contracts or the lack of contracts or the wording to divide and conquer, to misinform people. These are tactics that are used, and as much as I have so much boiling inside of me for these corporations, I also want to say how much I respect that you don't resort to demonizing people who work in the mining industry, which is incredible, and how your organization, First Nations Women Advocating Responsible Mining, instead invites industry to engage meaningfully with First Nations. So I'm wondering, what is your strategy and philosophy behind what responsible mining could look like? And maybe how could the operation of these settler technologies possibly change under the operation of First Nations communities when you're actually able to communicate, engage, and really get through to them?
There are mines that are already operating, and that's a reality. And I know that a lot of people like to, look at it in a very polarized way because it simplifies things, but it also it cuts out of all of the complexity is where the change is going to happen. The companies will say, oh, well, if you have concerns around mining, that means you're against jobs. I've never said that I'm against people supporting their family or working and doing what they need to do to take care of their families. That's not what it's about. It's the systemic change that needs to happen. These mines are operating at the lowest common denominator of any responsibility in a lot of cases where, look at Mount Polley Mine. They have basically just taken care of their own interests. There's been no reparations. There's not even been an apology to the community because that would imply that they're at fault. So you have these communities who are largely impacted, who are left with all of the responsibility and the fallout from, and the pollution and the ongoing legacy of this polluted water and environment. And that's not responsible at all. So when we talk about responsible mining, it's about these companies being held to account, that they're following the rules around mining, that they're following the laws, that they're in compliance, that, they're at the highest standard that can be achieved because these mines are already a reality. They're already there. Simply shutting them down is not going to address the ongoing legacy problems of that mine because once a mine is there, it's there forever. So simply shutting down the entire industry, and I know that there are people who say, shut down all mining, just turn it all off and the problem will be solved. Well, it won't be solved because you don't understand mining if that's what you're asking for. These mines, there has to be a long-term plan for how water coming off the site is going to be treated forever. And people don't understand that when a mine comes in, they will usually have propose a small footprint size. They might have a closed water system where they're not discharging, but over time, they're eventually going to have to discharge if they're using water-covered tailings, and they produce a lot of wastewater in the process of mining. So there has to be a plan of how to deal with this. All of these abandoned mines, how are we going to deal with that? So we have to look at how do we take control and clean this up. Basically, there's this huge mess. We can't just walk away from it and say problem solved. We have to figure out a way to clean it up and to keep it in check so that it's anything that new that is proposed has a really super high standard. And these high standards include free, prior, informed consent from impacted Indigenous peoples. And Indigenous peoples have to have a say. There is a lot of knowledge and experience that comes from living in a place for millennia. There's lived experience. Even within my own life, I've seen major change on the Fraser River. And I've seen major changes in our territory in these concentrated areas around where the mines are operating in my own life. So you can imagine from the knowledge that's been passed down from generations before what that looks like. And so communities really need to be empowered to deal with these mines and how it impacts the larger watersheds. We need to be looking at watershed planning. We need to be looking at cumulative impacts. So we need to look at, okay, how is logging in the area impacting it? How is tourism impacting? How is all of the road building impacting this? The mines dumping from pulp mills, agricultural runoff, fertilizing in these big areas. How is this impacting the watershed? We need to be looking at bigger picture planning, and mining is a piece of that. It's part of that responsible planning, looking at land use plans. Really awesome movement that's moving forward now in Canada is the Indigenous Guardians, creating this Indigenous Guardians network of getting Indigenous people with this knowledge on the land because the government sure isn't doing it, and compliance and monitoring and making sure that the laws are being followed, that they would be using traditional knowledge on the land to be making the best decisions possible, to be fully engaged on the ground. Because right now you have bureaucrats in Victoria and British Columbia who are making these decisions with no knowledge whatsoever of what's actually happening on the ground because nobody's out there. So really engaging and working with Indigenous people is a really smart thing to do. And all of the work that we do will protect everybody, not just our own interests. It's for the greater good of the land and the water, which benefits everybody. And so I think companies say, oh, you're against jobs. I think that's a really immature response, and it's a really simplistic response, and it's a fear tactic. And I don't like to play that game. And, it's really about having an overall bigger picture, intelligent conversation, a difficult conversation about what needs to change and where we need to start shifting our values and what we need to sacrifice in exchange for that. Okay, maybe I'm not going to have every single thing that I want. What do I need? How do we recycle? How do we reuse? How do we really make that big shift away from consumerism to just, we're eating ourselves to death. We're consuming to the point that we're polluting everything. And so we need to really think about what we can individually do, what we can do in our community, in our watershed, in our province, internationally. All of these conversations, all of these threads have to be happening at the same time. And people will be able to contribute to different parts of those conversations. But the point is to get activated, to get motivated, and to do whatever you can. Whether you're an artist or somebody who's politically engaged, or you're working on subsistence fisheries or different types of sustainable food grown in your own community, all of these things contribute to this conversation. People need to become activated, and the apathy is what's going to kill us. The giving up, saying it's too big, it's going to happen anyway, that's what's going to kill us. When people ask me, this is really heavy work, don't you ever want to quit? I'll say, we don't have that luxury. We don't have that time. I'm not going to give up on my bloodline. I'm not going to be the one who quit. I'm not going to be the one who said, I'm too tired, it's too hard. I won't be that person, because my bloodline needs me. And I imagine a future for them that is healthier, that is stable, that is sustainable, that is based on these values. And we need to shift those values in our life in order for them to have it.
Wow, Jacinda, you are a heroine to me, hearing your conviction and your passion and you're so strong and brave. And gosh, I'm just taking a moment to take it all in. And
yeah, our kids need us.
Yeah.
Our kids need us. And that's just the simple truth. That's what we've been born into. So we just better just get busy and get on with it.
I so agree with you. And it's just insane, this dominant colonizer culture, how cannibalistic it is, how we're literally conditioned in this culture to eat ourselves alive. It's insane when you start pulling the threads and seeing the unraveling of all of these ecosystems. For what? For a gold ring? For what? I mean, we're giving up life for objects that become meaningless to so many people and are tossed into a shipping container that goes to China and to elsewhere in the world to go into landfills. I mean, it's really nuts. And I was thinking back to something you had just said about being on the land and really seeing what is happening, actually being able to witness, because I think in so many ways in this dominant culture, especially for those who don't live in these places, it's really easy to stay in denial or to stay uneducated or to just not understand the complexities of these issues. And I hear in your voice that you're someone who carries the lands you love with you wherever you go. And I'd love to close this conversation by hearing your thoughts on how important it is, amidst all the phone calls and meetings and conferences, to actually be on the land and listen to the forest, to the waters and the animals, and how they're all responding to all that's unfolding.
All of the, the advocacy work that I do, I just feel like I'm a microphone for a lot of people who might not have that voice or might not be at that point in their life. Colonization is real. It's happening today. It's not over. The Mount Polley disaster is not over. These are the realities that we deal with. And, just keeping focused on what is important. And it's really for me, it's to draw my strength from the land. And in the Uprivers film that we're touring with the Stand for Water campaign, I say being on the land makes you strong. It makes you strong physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, because you are consciously reconnecting to source, you're out there. Just yesterday, I was out harvesting Devil's Club and cedar bark and alder, and out there on the land, running up and down and slipping and, sliding up and down these mountains in Nukhalk territory and breathing in that medicine and being out there with friends and with my son. And that's healing. That's really healing. And it's so important to really make time to do that, because that's what it's all about. It would be really ironic and horrible if I spent all of my time in boardrooms trying to fight for clean water and clean environments and for our families, and then never actually got to do that myself. So I make a conscious effort to be in season and to put those values as a priority, and kind of schedule my calls and my work around making sure that I'm also harvesting salmon and I'm harvesting medicines and I'm going to birthday dinners with family and I'm doing these things that ground me and strengthen me and fuel me. The really cool thing too is when I go out to these communities and Indigenous people come, I have received so much medicine from different Indigenous people from territories from all over who will come to me and thank me for speaking out, and they'll give me medicine to smudge or teas or whatever it is that they may have to share and say, make sure you take care of yourself. Here's something from the land from here to help you in your journey. And to me, that is incredibly powerful. It's incredibly powerful work because they know that this work comes with great personal sacrifice also.
Yes. Yes. I can smell the Devil's Club as you were mentioning that amazing plant that I am so in love with. And I'm so relieved to hear that you have people that are supporting you and giving you medicine and acknowledging the sacrifice and all that you give to the land and to the people. And so from For the Wild, from all of us here, we are just so grateful that you do what you do. And this is a topic that I think really many more people need to be aware of. I think it's, like I said at the beginning, it's been something that has been in the shadows of other fossil fuel resource extractive industries. And so thank you so much for sharing so much with us today. And thank you, Jacinda.
One thing that I forgot to mention is one of the connections between getting off of fossil fuels and shifting to this green economy is that that's going to require a lot more mining because you're going to need rare earth materials, you're going to need copper, you're going to need all of these things. And I think that having the conversation around what is recyclable and reclaimable to put into this greener energy, you can't have this green energy without cleaned up mining practices. You can't be having dirty mining that's supplying this green energy. It just doesn't work. You're completely, shooting yourself in the foot with that. So that's a conversation that also needs to happen and that we're really trying to push, is that mining impacts us in so many different ways, and looking to a greener future, you have to clean up mining in order for that to happen.
Thank you so much for bringing that up, because I think about that a lot with solar panels and batteries and these quote unquote green technologies. But I almost started to think the other day that, oh my gosh, this is a farce. This is a trick. This green technology, it's not green. We're just switching industries. We're just extracting more from somewhere else and poisoning a different area. We're not actually getting out of consumer culture, which is, I think about, and I've talked about that a lot on the show, the falsities of green energy. And I'm not saying there isn't any solutions, and I'm not trying to say that solar panels are evil per se, but I also think that when we don't actually look at where the materials are coming from and what kind of impact that is having, and then weighing that out with what we have been doing, and then seeing, well, actually, neither of them are the solution. It's not the solution to just plug your computer into a solar panel that goes to an iCloud that has a mega storage facility somewhere in the desert. Just because you're not printing out a piece of paper, but it's being stored in the memory of something. We have to really look at this. And I think what's so challenging is that it always comes back to consumption. It always comes back to this addiction to consumerism. And it's so challenging because so many people don't want to look at that. That's the last thing. They don't want to give up. And it's so crazy. I mean, this really gets me in a whirlwind, and I'll try to stop myself within a minute or less. But I think, oh my goodness, it's so hard for many people in the dominant culture to give up their stuff. But people are so willing to give up clean water, so willing to give up forest and salmon. But they'd rather have junk that becomes obsolete within a couple years. It makes me crazy. And of course, I'm still within that system too. So I look at myself and I try to see all the ways that I'm complicit as well. And so anyways, not to totally get on an existential tangent with that, I really am grateful that you brought up mining with renewable energy, because we have to look at that. We cannot turn a blind eye and then have ourselves in the same situation with these new technologies. There's no techno fix. And I'm so inspired by you. So thank you. And you've given me so much food for thought today. So I can't wait to re-listen to this interview and sit with all of this. So thank you so much, and we'll be in touch really soon.
That sounds great. And thank you so much for the work that you do too. That it's really part of the connecting, being able to hear the stories from the people that you talk with is really inspiring for me as well. And I want you to know that your work too, like the ripples that go out from what you're doing, is really important, and it's fuel for me as well. So thank you for your work.
Thank you so much for listening to For the Wild podcast. I'm Ayana Young. The music you heard today was from Kayla Cohen and JACINDA MACK. Our theme music is Silence Returns by Bo and Like a River from Kate Wolf. I'd like to thank our incredible podcast team, our editor and producer Andrew Storrs, research director Madison Mogolsky, media director Molly Lee Bove, and research assistant Francesca Glassbell. The questions for this episode were crafted by Madison Mogolsky, Francesca Glassbell, and myself, Ayana Young. If you haven't rated us on iTunes, please do so, as it helps spread these messages and expand our community. All right, thanks again, and until next time.
The sounds of people talking